You're listening to episode 80 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus speaks with us about false memory creation. Many of us have had very compelling experiences during meditation. We've cleared away the mental noise, calmed our brains, and, supposedly, we're seeing things as they are. We're penetrating into truth with a capital T. The term direct knowing is often used to describe what's going on, as if what's happening is somehow no longer dependent on the functioning of our brains, our bodies. That it is something external to this fathom-long body, despite Buddha's statements to the contrary. We are essentially just process. That which we call our selves was handily disassembled into the interactions of heaps a long time ago, and yet we continue to see a sometimes fearful, sometimes arrogant, sometimes angry adherence to the view that the thoughts which arise in our minds are reliable, even though this practice and modern science both show us that's just not true. This becomes particularly relevant when, as secularists, we face the socialized idea of rebirth in our Buddhist communities. This is taken by many as simple, unquestioned fact, while other post-mortem theories are unquestioningly dismissed. And if a secular Buddhist has the audacity to question a literal rebirth, we are called heretical, dangerous, or just plain ignorant and following a lesser path. Things that occur in meditation are very convincing, very moving, and potentially very transformative, but that doesn't make them real. We have evidence, not stories, but evidence, that memories can be created with only a few subtle suggestions. Why is it so disturbing that there is a perfectly natural explanation for memories of past lives, and that explanation is that they are not true memories at all? That is certainly possible, even likely. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus is Distinguished Professor of Social Ecology and Professor of Law and Cognitive Science at University of California, Irvine. She studies human memory, and her experiments reveal how memories can be changed by things that we are told. Facts, ideas, suggestions, and other post-event information can modify our memories. The legal field, so reliant on memories, has been a significant application of memory research. Loftus is also interested in psychology and law. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice amnesia. Yes, it's a real drink, and the recipe is linked on the episode page. And our guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'm very glad to be speaking with you today because as you and I were just chatting before we started the interview, we met at TAM, the Amazing Meeting, and you did a talk on your book, which is what we'll be talking about today, which is The Myth of Repressed Memory, False Memories and Allegations of Sexual Abuse. So before we go into the book itself and specifically on memories and false memories, Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with this.
Okay, well, gee, how far back to go? Well, first of all, I went to graduate school and got a PhD in psychology, and I started to study human memory while I was still in graduate school, and I was actually doing very theoretical work, the kind of work you could talk to 5 other people about, and they would care as much as you. But after getting my PhD and beginning my academic career, I really wanted to study something that had more social relevance, more application to real-world problems. And so I thought, well, I've got some expertise in the field of memory, and I've always been interested in legal cases. Maybe I'll study the memory of people for crimes and accidents and other legally relevant events, and that's what I started to do. And I just did lots of experiments where we showed people films of crimes or accidents. Sometimes we'd stage live events in front of people, and we looked at the accuracy of their memory and the errors in memory. That's the start.
And it sounds like, and you did some of the demonstrations during your talk at TAM about how our memories are not accurate. So before we get into the false memory creation and the supposedly repressed memories, tell us a little bit about the brain not being a tape recorder.
Well, that is one of the things that we know about memory. It doesn't work like a tape recorder. You don't just record the event and play it back later. The process is much more complex. And actually, when we are remembering something, we're often reconstructing what happened. We take bits and pieces of experience, sometimes things that occurred at different times, different places, and can blend this information together to create what feels like a memory. And that's why psychologists often talk about the constructive or reconstructive nature of memory.
So how then did you go from studying this under controlled conditions to getting involved with allegations of sexual abuse in supposedly recovered memories?
Well, there's a little bit of a journey there. So there I was, with my being a university professor and doing experiments on memory and memory distortion. I specifically was looking at what happens when what I was trying to look at is a situation where, for example, you see a crime and then you talk to other people about it, or you are interrogated by an investigator who might have an agenda or a hypothesis about what happened, or you see news coverage about an event that you yourself experienced. In all of these cases, there's an opportunity there for new information, sometimes misleading information, to enter your memory system and cause a contamination or a distortion in your memory. And I wanted to study that process, and so that's what I and my collaborators did. We looked at people who had seen some event and then were given some misinformation. So, for example, I show people an accident where a car goes through a stop sign, and later on I suggest that it was a yield sign, and many people will adopt the suggestion and claim that what they saw was the yield sign instead of the stop sign. So this phenomenon where misinformation can distort your memory became known as the misinformation effect, and it's now been widely studied in the field of memory. There have been hundreds and hundreds of studies, but in the early 90s, when we began to see a different kind of legal case where people were going into therapy and they were engaged in some collection of procedures that led them to believe that they'd been, raped in satanic rituals, that they'd been forced into watching animal sacrifice, the baby sacrifice, the works. Then we're looking at the situation, and these whole memories appear to be created in the minds of people, and that might be a very different kind of process than just turning a stop sign into a yield sign. And so we needed to find a way an analog a way to study this phenomenon that wouldn't be harmful to people, but would still teach us something about the development of very rich false memories. And that's how I got into the development of the Lost in the Mall study.
Tell us about that, because that was fascinating. You brought that up during your talk. Tell us more about that, because my roommate and I at breakfast this morning mentioned she was reading another book where, oh yes, this one person created a study where they created false memories about being lost in a mall. I said, interestingly enough, that's who I'm interviewing later on today.
Really? Well, yeah, okay. So there, I wanted to have a procedure where we could try to plant these rich false memories. Of course, you don't want to harm the subjects, even in the name of science. You can't do whatever you want to people. So, what is it that we could plant in the minds of people that would have been at least mildly traumatic if it actually happened? And we came up with the idea, why not try to make people believe when they were 5 or 6 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall, that they were frightened, they were crying, and they ultimately were rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. And that's what we decided to do. Then we had to develop a way of doing that. And the method we used was we told our subjects, look, we've talked to your mother. We found out some things that happened to you when you were 5 or 6 years old. And we really had talked to the mother. And we got some true memories from the mother. And then the mother helped us make up this totally false event about being lost and frightened and rescued. And we told these memory stories to our subjects. We asked them to try to remember them if they could. 3 true ones and then the made-up false one. And by the time we were done with 3 suggestive interviews, about a quarter of our subjects had fallen for the suggestion and began to remember all or part of this made-up experience. So that was our first clue that we could examine in a more controlled setting the development of these very rich false memories. And when people come up with these stories, they don't just say, oh yeah, that happened. They'll give you, sometimes very concrete details. They'll describe the person who rescued them and what they look like. They'll say things like, I heard my name be called over the loudspeakers in the shopping mall. All kinds of sensory detail added to these newfound, I'll have to put memories in quotes because they're not really authentic.
Right, and that was shown in these studies. So it was interesting the connection in your book that you established that even in some exams that you had some experiments that you had your students do just on their own before you did an official experiment that you got approval from and could be done as a study, you had some of your grad students go and I'd try making a suggestion or two and build on it. And they did. And it worked with disturbing ease, in fact.
Well, though, there were some anecdotal examples because I had been teaching a class and I gave my class an assignment to, go out and try to create a little memory in the mind of something for something that didn't happen. I wanted my students to think about how they might do this and how they might see for themselves that it could be done. And so we had a few anecdotal examples before we actually submitted the formal study, which was then approved by our Human Subjects Committee, and we launched the study, published it, and one of the nice things that happened as a result of it is and as a result of the memory controversies in the society is that other scientists got interested in this phenomenon, and they designed some, wonderful follow-ups to this work and planted false memories that you were attacked by a vicious animal, that you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. All of these, completely made up with the help of family members and inserted into the minds of unsuspecting subjects.
And that's where things start to get have an unfortunate turn when we talk about the myth of repressed memory, when we have situations where there are allegations of sexual abuse that are supposedly coming from these repressed memories that are only just coming to light. And there are cases that you talk about in the book that are just heart-wrenching, where families are torn apart based on memories that seem to have been implanted rather than having been reflections of actual events, that there is no physical evidence for any of the allegations in place. And one of the things I do want to read before we get into that is that you do make it very clear that you're not I'm actually quoting from the book, we're not challenging the reality of childhood sexual abuse or traumatic memories. We do not question the trauma of the sexually abused child. That what you're doing is expressing some healthy skepticism about how some memories may have occurred. You're not saying that children are not being abused or this is not horribly traumatic. That's not it at all. I just want to make sure listeners to this episode understand that we're not.
Well, I think that is such an important point to make because, obviously there are thousands and thousands of women and children and men in this society who have genuine experiences of sexual abuse. They deserve and need our greatest sympathy and help. But I am not talking about, the person who knew her or his a whole life that she was molested and only recently maybe got the courage to tell a trusted friend or a trusted therapist about it. I'm talking about one specific kind of case, and generally these cases are cases where she goes into therapy, maybe she's got an eating disorder, maybe she's got depression, and she ends up with a therapist who has one and only one idea about what could be wrong, and that is a history of sexual abuse that's repressed into the unconscious, and that the therapist's job is to dig it out. And there begins a set of procedures that has led so many people into developing false memories and accusing their family members or their former neighbors or former teachers or what have you, and just totally wrecking the lives of lots of people, and in the process trivializing the experiences of the genuinely abused people.
Yeah, I thought it very interesting that at a point in the book, and this is on page 154, 155, you say that the symptom lists toss out the net that entangles the whole human race. And then you do quote Carol Tavris again, who's been in the podcast, that the same list could be used to identify oneself as someone who loves too much, someone who suffers from self-defeating personality disorder, or a mere human being in the late 20th century. The list is general enough to include everybody, at least sometimes. Nobody doesn't fit in. So they're using these lists of, are you sometimes depressed? Well, yes. Oh, goodness, I am. Of course, everyone is sometimes. And
I know those checklists where you can find out. Anybody can find them. Do you trust people too much, or do you trust too little? Do you drink too much, or are you totally abstinent? So people can easily find themselves on this list and get talked into believing that they've got the symptoms, and that they're only going to get better if they dig out, some allegedly buried recalcitrant trauma memories.
And there's something wrong with them if they don't dig it out, that really that is the source of their problem, and they just need to keep trying if they haven't got it yet. I found it very interesting that one of the cases you mentioned was a woman who remembers very well. She was molested by her uncle for over a long period of time, and was seeing a therapist then as an adult for some other issues. And the therapist said, have you been abused as a child? Yes, I was, by my uncle. And the therapist insisted that there was more to it. It must have been your parents too, and kept hammering on this poor person who they remembered their actual abuse. And it was really, as you had said, trivializing that actual event and insisting on one that hadn't occurred.
Well, and she is an example of now a growing collection of individuals who they call themselves retractors. They're people who went into therapy. They, got talked into believing that they were molested by, one or more people. They may have accused their family members. They may have broken up the family. They may have sued their family members in a civil lawsuit. And now they begin to realize that their memories are false. And as a memory scientist, that's a very interesting phenomenon for me. How do you start to realize that your memories are false? But they do. And some of them have now sued their former therapists for planting false memories, and there have been some quite sizable jury verdicts as a result of those lawsuits.
Interesting. And you even showed during your talk at TAM some information about, the question came up, how do we tell the difference between a real, I'm making quotey fingers in the air again, real memory versus an implanted memory? And what the brain scans that you showed were indicating is that really there's not much difference. You can't really tell, this is a fake one because it's in this region of the brain, and this is a real one because it's in this region. That's not how it works.
Right. I mean, if you get a collection of true memories and a collection of false memories, and you look to see, how are they similar or how are they different? Occasionally you can find some statistical differences between this group of true and group of false memories. The group of true memories can have a little more sensory details about the sights and sounds and the feel of the experience. And with neuroimaging, you can sometimes see a little bit of statistical difference, but the overwhelming impression here from this research is that the true memories and false memories look very similar. And behaviorally speaking, true memories and false memories both can be expressed with a lot of detail, with a lot of confidence, and even with a lot of emotion. And so you can't look at somebody, although it's tempting, when they tell their story in a confident and an emotional manner, it's tempting to say, oh my God, it must be true. You can't without independent corroboration, because those false memories can be expressed with lots and lots of detail and emotion.
Mm-hmm. And it's not that the question has come up when I bring up the creation of false memories, or that there are things that our mind puts out which we may take as memories which are not. They're simply flashes of our brains in activity in deep meditation. People will say, oh, but this wasn't a good thing, this memory of a past life, and it was really hard on the family and all of that. Well, yes, not all of these things that we attach to and conceive of as real memories, they're not necessarily going to be positive, and certainly not in the case of repressed sexual trauma. That is not the case. The idea that a creative memory has to be a happy one is just not true.
No, it's not true. I mean, I often am asked, why would anyone want to make up something so awful as that their parents forced them into satanic rituals and brutalized them for years, and my answer to that is if there's a cost to it, and there certainly is some cost, you have estrangement of the family and other costs, there must be a really big benefit. So look for the benefit, and often that benefit is they find a group of like-minded people who will give them a lot of sympathy and empathy. They have an explanation for their problems. Everybody's got problems, and now your explanation doesn't have to be that you're crazy or that you're a bad person. It's just that you were a victim of abuse, and it's sometimes a more palatable explanation for people.
if it's not your responsibility, that takes a big weight off of this, and that people, especially in our culture, take on a great deal of personal responsibility, and with that a great deal of stress, and not to see that is also an opportunity to change how we respond to what's going on in our lives. One of the things I also wanted to get into is you quote The Crucible throughout the book, beautifully so. It's one of my favorite plays. And it really quite well reflects what's going on in this case. There are allegations of witchcraft, and all we have are people who are saying that there are such things. And one of the things I want to read, it's not from The Crucible, but it ties quite well with what you're saying there. This is on page 108, and this is one of the fellows who was accused of these crimes. And he's talking with the therapist, who's the one who says, "Oh, you must have done this." And the poor person says, "If I can't remember these incidents, either I repress the memories, in which case I'm guilty, or I'm in denial, and my denial is then taken as proof of my guilt." And the therapist replies, "It's complicated." And it's like, well, yes, damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Right.
And there's no way in these therapists' mind to get out of that. How do you deal with that sort of attitude and logical impossibility in court? How does that play out?
Well, generally when I am brought into court cases, oftentimes somebody is accusing somebody else based on supposedly recovered, repressed memories. So they, in one case, for example, a daughter accused her father of raping her over 11 years and forcing her into having sex with the family dog, all supposedly repressed until the therapy brought it to light. I'm usually trying to do two things in these court cases. One is to answer the question, if these memories aren't real, where could they have come from? And that's easy for me because I can talk a lot about the now large body of scientific work on the creation of false memories and memory distortion that teach us that even ordinary human beings can be led to have these kinds of false memories with enough suggestion. But the other thing I'm often doing in these court cases, because sometimes these mental health professionals will come in there and say, "Oh yeah, there's lots of evidence for repression. And that's how memory works. We can take 11 years of brutal rapes and banish it into the unconscious, and we have lots of evidence for that." I mean, I'm often there to say there is no credible scientific support for that claim, and to essentially scrutinize the shoddy evidence that these experts are sometimes trying to use to fob off on the court system and to claim that it constitutes proof.
Yeah, and it's not, and this comes up again and again in your book, that there ends up being no physical evidence. It's just anecdotal evidence that only arises under certain conditions. And you list out a few of those, and I wanted to just briefly cover what some of those are. Is that first, there's someone who is clearly under some sort of stress. They are upset. They're seeing a therapist for something going on in their lives. They have a leader figure, whether that's a therapist or a church figure or someone who's encouraging this idea or making the suggestion that this is people who experience and again, we've seen that list could be anybody. But if you match any of these, you were assaulted as a child and you're just repressing those memories. And then they also have a group of people who are reinforcing that. And it's usually support groups that they get involved with to keep reinforcing that possibility. Tell us more about how that goes into supporting the creation of these memories.
But are you asking about the support groups in particular?
Yeah, the support groups and some of they also can get involved with doing specific kinds of therapies like hypnosis and other things to help revive the memories.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say that having group therapy can sometimes be very helpful to people. If you have women, for example, who are recently gone through a horrible experience of a recent rape, and you put them together into a group to share their experiences and to comfort one another, and I mean it can be beneficial. But what was going on in some of these repressed memory cases is you had these people joining group therapy, some of whom didn't have any memories of abuse, thinking their memories were still repressed. And you have other people telling these stories. And picture the dynamics of what's going on here. Who's going to get the attention? The one who says, well, I know I was abused, but I don't have the memories? Or the one who's telling these stories of brutal rape and bestiality? So you end up in this situation with almost like a kind of memory poker where there's practically an encouragement to say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to match your memory and raise you one with my even more lurid memory. Because that's what's going to get the attention and sympathy. So it's a bit of a dangerous situation. I should also mention, I found it very interesting in Carl Sagan's, wonderful book, The Demon Haunted World.
Yep.
Yeah.
You go, girl. You're my favorite person for quoting that.
Well, he drew a parallel between these kinds of, let's say, the satanic ritual abuse, repressed memory cases, and the people who believe they were abducted by aliens. Because there too, as sometimes starts with a problem. Maybe a person experiences sleep paralysis, which can be a little scary if you've never had it happen before. They end up with an authority figure who believes in, alien abduction and who maybe does some hypnosis, as John Mack used to do, the Harvard psychiatrist, and gets them, thinking and believing that they were abducted. Then they get into groups together and they share experiences, and now you've got people on their way to believing that they've actually been taken up into spaceships, sexually experimented upon, returned to their beds on Earth, and they can have very vivid experiences of this and be very emotional when they're recounting these experiences.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, the emotional content of it, the level of heightened involvement with the memory doesn't make it a true one.
No, it doesn't. And, there was a doctoral student of mine, now Dr. Cara Laney, did a terrific doctoral dissertation where she planted false memories of for example, witnessing your parents have a physical fight when you were a kid. And then she found some people who really did have this experience happen to them. And when you compare the true memories and the false memories, and just in terms of how much emotion they say they're feeling when they think about it, it's equivalent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and her paper, I think in 2008 with you, is emotional content of true and false memories.
Right, and that's one that I've got posted on my University of California Irvine website.
Yeah. So in looking at this over time, do you see that the allegations that are based on the supposed recollection of repressed memories, do you see that as becoming more common, or is it starting to lessen, or was this just a very bad spot in the realm of psychoanalysis, or what is the trend? Where do you think it's going?
Well, first of all, I think there's been a sea change of attitude about this whole repressed memory business, that we have been seeing fewer cases. They're not completely over. There's still people being prosecuted, there are people being sued, and there's still people in prison who I believe are completely innocent. But there are fewer of these cases. The typical case of a claim of repressed memory. What we are seeing a little bit more of these days is these clergy scandal cases. And here, they're a little bit different. What sometimes happens is, maybe there's somebody who really, some people who really were abused when they were children by priests or other religious figures in their lives, and they speak out about it now. Maybe their story gets into the paper, and these are people who never forgot. They just never talked about it. But then the publicity about it triggers in the minds of other people these claims of, oh yeah, I think this happened to me too, and I think I repressed my memory. And they try to use the initial accusations as their corroboration for the repressed memory, when in fact it's not independent corroboration. It's the story that triggered the claim. And so then you end up with 500 cases in Boston and hundreds in some other jurisdictions. And how you sort through these things to find which are the true ones and which are these, jump on the bandwagon, and it, is a big problem.
Yeah, I noticed that one of the articles that you have posted, and again, people listening to the podcast, there is, of course, an episode page for this interview, and I will be linking to Elizabeth's website, so all of these studies we're talking about are linked there. But there's one you have that is from 2007 in Consciousness and Cognition, where it's false claims about false memory research, in which people who've essentially are advocates of, oh no, these are real, that we're actually reclaiming them, are pushing back about the idea that no, these are false memories. We can implant them. We know that is an actual kind of thing that happens in the brain. And this is a very good refutation of those pushbacks. And there are a few different claims in there. So people who are listening to this who may be thinking, oh, but there's no real show that these are being falsely implanted. There are some responses to that belief that you can check out, and studies that these are linked to, where these are controlled studies. We've got some controls on them. They are blinded, and they're good studies. So this isn't something that's just a theoretical construct, as the potential mechanisms for repressed memories have been. I haven't seen any evidence, and I imagine, Elizabeth, you haven't either, about, okay, so what's the mechanism of repressed memories? And in fact, somewhere in the book you even make mention of an opposing therapist who was talking about, they had conflicting ideas about, well, very traumatic events are very clearly remembered, and yet they were trying to make the case that this very traumatic event of sexual abuse by a parent was repressed, which were in conflict, and they seemed to change their story halfway through from a paper they had just published about this.
Well, yeah, because there were people out there who tried to claim that, okay, well, maybe one traumatic experience you would remember, but multiple traumatic experiences you'd repress. And that kind of defies everything we know about the workings of memory. I mean, what we know about memory is the more times something happens, the better you remember.
It's reinforced, yeah.
Right. So.
Interesting. So Elizabeth, what's next? I mean, how do we combat this concept by education, and what form does that education take? Do we get more therapists who are experienced in recognizing where implantation, where they themselves may be doing it, and make sure they're educated on how not to do that? What can we do to combat this?
Well, first of all, one of the interesting things that happened along the way after these, first we saw thousands of cases where people accused other people, and maybe they got them prosecuted, or maybe they sued them in civil court. And so our courtrooms were flooded with these cases. Then we saw these retractor cases where the individual went into therapy, developed the false memory, accused their family member, and then began to realize their memories were false. Some of those individuals then sued their former therapists, and these were just straightforward medical malpractice cases. After that happened, some insurance companies came forward and said, look, if you do recovered memory therapy, we're not going to insure you. And, so that was one little ingredient in helping to slow down this, this wave of, we'll call it, false memory cases that were damaging patients and their families. But I think people just really need to, when somebody, gets in there and tries to claim, oh, we've got 70 studies that support the idea of repressed memory, you need to say, what exactly are those studies?
Right.
And give me the best study. And then listen to the details of the very best study, and you'll see it's in no way does this support the idea of massive repression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, we have been speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, Distinguished Professor of Social Ecology and Professor of Law and Cognitive Science, and you're at the University of California, Irvine. I want to make sure I read the web address where to find you, although I do have this linked on the web page. For those of you who are at your computer, you can go to this directly. It is seweb.uci.edu/faculty/Loftus, Loftus. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here. This has been wonderfully enlightening.
Oh, my pleasure, and good luck to you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.